What's up, Precision Junkies? Kellen back with another episode of Inside Out Precision. And in last week's video, we covered how to tune your broadhead to your arrow to make sure that they're spinning true and there's no wobble in your arrow. Also how to line up the vanes with your blades, which, as I explained in that video, is not as important as it is that they're spinning true. But I just like to do it to make sure that all my arrows are cookie cutter. I can practice with just one broadhead and not dull, multiple of them up. And I know that all my arrows are coming out of my bow identically. So that was last week's video on tuning the arrow to the broadhead. This week is going to be on how to tune your bow to ensure that your broadheads and your arrows or your field tips are flying together. So most broadheads on the package advertise flies just like a field tip. And yes, if your bow is tuned well and it's a well-manufactured broadhead, it should fly just like your field tip. But the catch here is that more times, like more often than not, we get a bullet hole through paper with a fletched arrow, and then we go out and we sight a guy in at 20 yards and he's perfectly dialed at 20, and then he screws a broadhead on after we've done all the steps that I covered in the arrow broadhead tuning video. And he still is, they're hitting right or left or a little high or low at 20 yards, and they can't figure out what's going on. And usually this has to do with just a minor tweak that you're going to need to make in your rest. So here's my solution. If I'm sighted in perfectly at 20 yards with a field tip, and then I screw on a broadhead and I shoot my broadhead right behind my field tip, and I impact to the right of my field point, what's happening is that your arrow, when it comes out, even if it's a bullet hole through paper, maybe at 15 feet or 20 feet down, you're getting just a minor tail left kick. And what that does with a fixed blade head, and I want to preface this by saying this is really only true for fixed blades because mechanicals do not steer an arrow. They don't have blades that are open that steer an arrow like a fixed blade. So for those fixed blade or for those mechanical shooters, you don't really need to worry about this. Your arrows will fly like your field tips. But for a fixed blade, if my arrow comes out and kicks to the left, it turns the blades to the right. They catch wind and they will plane to the right. So it's kind of the same concept as bear shaft tuning. So if you're shooting a bow like a Matthews, let's say, where you have a top hat or a spacer system that you work on, chances are if you swap the top hats and push the top hats left, it's going to overcorrect the problem and you're actually going to get worse arrow flight. So for one of those bows, I would actually just micro adjust the rest, and you're going to move it towards the broadhead, because remember, for arrows, if the tail is kicking left, that's pushing the broadhead to the right. The broadhead is planing to the right. So I'd micro adjust my rest to the right. That'll bring the tail of the arrow in straight, and then that arrow should track with my field tip. Now, if I move my rest, it is going to shift my impact with my field tip. If I move my rest to the right, my field tip, when I shoot it next, should impact to the right. So don't be afraid, shoot your field tip. If it impacts to the right, expect that. Then shoot your broadhead, and as long as they're hitting together, then I know that I just need to re-sight. I just need to move my sight over. Now if I shoot and I move my rest a little bit and I shoot my field tip and I hit to the right and then I shoot my broadhead and I'm hitting to the left, then I know I've actually overcorrected and I need to bring that rest back to the left a little bit. And when I say bring it back right or left, I'm talking, I usually start with like a 32nd of an inch. I mean, such a small amount that it's really not going to affect your center shot hardly at all, but it will greatly influence the flight of your broadhead. Now, if you're hitting high or low, you're actually going to move the rest opposite of your broadhead, because if I'm hitting low, that means my arrow is coming out kicking tail high, and the blades are catching wind, and that arrow is nosediving. So by bringing up the rest, so if I'm hitting low with my broadhead, I bring the rest up, that levels the arrow out, and then I get a straight path of flight. So remember that. Left, right, move your rest towards the broadhead. For elevation, move it opposite of the broadhead. Now on a bow like most bows that have a yoke system, like a Hoyt, or that's just the first one that comes to mind, but a bow with a yoke system, you can actually use the yokes kind of like how you would use a rest with the Matthews, or basically how you would paper tune a Hoyt. So if I shoot, let's say I'm shooting an RX1 and I shoot and my broadhead is again to the right, that means I'm kicking tail left. Now in your paper tuning, to get rid of a tail left tear, you're gonna put like a half twist or a twist in the left yoke. So for a broadhead, if I'm hitting to the right, I'm going to put a twist in the left yoke. So it's the opposite yoke of the direction that your broadhead is hitting. If I'm hitting to the left, I'm gonna put a twist in my right yoke. Sometimes it's easier to achieve the same amount of cam lean, rather than putting one twist, a full twist in one side, it's easier to do a half twist in one side and out of the other to achieve that same amount of cam lean. But I generally just start with one half twist. So let's say I'm hitting to the right, I'm gonna put a half twist in my left yoke and see if that clears it up. If it doesn't, I'll take a half twist out of my right yoke, because that does the same thing as putting one into my left. And it won't affect my timing as bad, because I'm just keeping everything even basically. Now, obviously you don't want to get too much cam lean. I would say if you can't correct the tear with more than a turn and a half in and a turn and a half out of your yoke, especially if you already have kind of severe cam lean, then I would look at the rest. I would put everything back to where it was, and I would just micro adjust the rest, just like I would with a Matthews or any bow that uses a spacer or a top hat system. So you can really affect the flight of your arrow, and when you shoot it through paper, you're probably not gonna see any difference, because we're moving stuff just so minutely that it's still gonna shoot a bullet hole through paper, but 10, 15, 20 feet down the range, we had a little bit of kick one way or the other, and by making these slight adjustments, we're gonna take that kick out. So this is a really important step for you guys that are shooting fixed blade broadheads. It doesn't matter how good your broadhead is, how well you square the end of your arrow up. You know, if your bow is just a little bit out of tune, you're gonna see that when you shoot your field tip and your broadheads. Now, I will say that I have, well, for example, with my triax, when I got my broadheads and my field points to hit exactly the same all the way out to like 60 yards, when I went and shot my bow through paper, now I'm left-handed, so remember that, I was actually getting a tail high and a tail right tear. So a tear at about 1 or 2 o'clock, only about 1/8 of an inch. I mean, just a teeny tiny little bit, but it was not a perfect bullet hole. But my bow tuned and shot the best right there. And my arrows, you know, when I would watch them, they flew like absolute darts. So don't get caught up on the bullet hole thing. That's always just the starting point. You know, even some of my target bows, once I do my walk back and group tuning and all that sort of stuff, bare shaft tuning, lots of times when I go shoot it through paper again, it's not a perfect bullet hole with the fletch shaft. It's close, but it might not be perfect. So don't get completely hung up on, you know, man, it's shooting a bullet hole. It should be, you know, my broadhead and my field tip should be right together. It's okay to move things around a little bit to where, you know, that arrow may not be a perfect bullet hole, but all the way out to 60 yards, your broadheads and your field tips are, you know, side by side. So that's my advice for it. I'm sure there's other ways people do it, but this is certainly the most common for fixed blade broadheads. So if you haven't done that, you know, you do need a press if you're gonna mess with the yokes on your bow. So maybe go by your local pro shop and kind of talk to them. You can play around with your rest at home. Just make sure that you take note of where the rest already is. That way, if when you're playing around with things and you screw things up even worse, you can go right back to where you started and start from ground zero. So if you have any questions on this, please feel free to DM me on Instagram. We're at inside_out_precision, or hit us up on YouTube here, and I'll do my best to get back to you. This is something that we do with pretty much every customer that is having trouble with broadheads. You know, we have them come in, we work with them, get everything dialed in, and then they can be confident that, you know, they can go out and shoot a local 3D shoot, turn right around, grab their broadheads, go out the door hunting, and the broadheads are gonna fly right with their field tips. So it's really good peace of mind knowing that everything is tuned in a way where you're gonna have consistent flight with both broadheads and field tips. So as usual, hit the subscribe button below if you haven't already. We've had a lot of good comments recently, so keep those rolling in. And until next time, keep it in the middle, and remember, precision is a decision.